starters off for the day. Now, after that, we'll have the secretary of the organization that is organizing this conference to say a little bit about the organization for us to start. However, there's been a slight change because Professor Hakim Ade, who has very early, very much on time, because he has somewhere else to go, and he doesn't want to miss the day, so he has offered to give his part of the program before he leaves, because he's got an appointment and he should be there very, very, very soon. So what we'll do is straight after Reverend Herman Asafuaje, who's going to give the prayers. After that, I think Kofi Rob is the secretary, and then Professor Hakim Ade can lead us on with something to say about, I think is it Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism. I think it's a good place to start our day, to sort of get us all woken up. Okay, thank you very much. So please welcome Reverend Herman Asafuaje.
All right, just a short prayer, committing the proceedings of the day to Almighty God. Our Heavenly Father, we come before you this morning acknowledging your divinity and sovereignty and recognizing you as the Almighty God of all creation. We give you thanks for the array of talent, ability, and capacity here this morning. It's your word that we must commit everything to you, and when we do that, you would certainly direct our paths. So Father God, this morning, we commit, protect us, give us the wisdom to be able to get through the day successfully. Father, bless each one of us, and we ask for your peace, love, and harmony to prevail in this auditorium. I pray this and ask for your intervention. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Okay, so I think Kofi has kindly given up saying a little bit about the organization so that Professor Hakim Ade can sort of get on with discussing this subject. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, brothers and sisters. It's a great pleasure to come and address this assembly. I must apologize for the fact that I have to leave for another appointment.
Yeah, I'm just having to use my phone. It's going to cost me money.
Very grateful to the organizers for allowing me to speak.
I'd add $200 to my phone bill. Yeah, but I mean, we just pay it out of the money that we have.
So I've been asked to say something about Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism. So I have a few points that I can make, and then if anyone has any questions, I'll try and answer them before I go. The first thing I should say, I think, about Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism is that his commitment to and his devotion to Pan-Africanism was very much, if you like, a product of the times in which he lived and the circumstances of those times. He came of age in the 1930s at a time when the global Pan-African movement was at its height. So he was very clearly influenced by his experiences in West Africa and by such organizations as the National Congress of West Africa, as well as by his experiences in the United States, his activity with the African Students Association, his familiarization with the Garvey movement, Universal Negro Improvement Association, as well as other political currents that he came into contact with in the United States, including the communist movement of that time. And of course, he was also influenced by the international circumstances of that period, particularly the invasion of Ethiopia by fascist Italy and the ramifications of that had for Africa and for Africans globally. And of course, Nkrumah, even at that time, involved himself in some of the key events at the time, as I say, particularly in those involving the African Students Association, in which he was a leading member. And he took part in several conferences in the United States that had a Pan-African character that I won't go into now because of time constraints. Excuse me. He then, as you know, in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, came to Britain and was immediately immersed in the preparations for the famous Manchester Pan-African Congress, which took place in October of that year. And I think that the Manchester Congress had a very significant effect on Nkrumah. For one, he came under the influence or mentorship, we can say, of George Padmore, the famous Trinidadian Pan-Africanist and the main organizer of that Congress, but also the influence of the politics of that Congress, which were, I guess, some of the most important aspects of that Congress were the idea that not only the need for the unity of Africans within the continent as well as within the diaspora, but the idea that in the struggle against colonialism, it was the masses of the people who were going to be the key force that were going to effect change. The Congress resolutions, particularly those in which Nkrumah played a key role, which addressed West Africa, also highlighted, if you like, certain principles which the leading Pan-Africanists of the day, people like Isaac Wallace Johnson and others, had developed over a whole period. So they rejected the colonial boundaries, they rejected the alien political institutions which they said had been imposed on Africa by the colonial powers, and they also opposed what they referred to as the monopoly of capital, or today we'd say the capital-centered system. So these principles then informed Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism going forward, and we can say that some of these principles were implemented not only in his Pan-African activities, but also in his activities, his anti-colonial activities in the Gold Coast as it then was. So the 1945 Manchester Congress was an important element in the development of Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism. Next was his involvement in the West African National Secretariat, which was established directly after that Congress here in London, which again centered not on, you can say, global Pan-Africanism, if you like, but on West African Pan-Africanism or West African nationalism, as Nkrumah would have termed it at the time. And the West African National Secretariat was an organization which was concerned particularly with the unity of West Africa. It kind of based itself in some ways on the traditions of the National Congress, but with the additions that it also wanted to include not only Anglophone West Africa, but also Francophone West Africa. And it had the conception that if there was a united and liberated West Africa, including all of the British and French colonies, that would be the basis for a united Africa. And their conception of united Africa was a union of African socialist republics, as they said at the time.
Nkrumah at that time said a united, free and independent West Africa is a political condition for Africa's redemption and emancipation, for the emancipation of Africans and people of African descent throughout the world. So that gives you an idea of his thinking at that time. Then he, as you know, returned to the Gold Coast in 1947 and immersed himself in the anti-colonial struggle, firstly with the, I don't need to tell you all this, anyway, in various organisations, UGCC and then his own CPP and so on. And he, again, almost from that period, from the late 1940s, began to build on this conception of West African unity. That West African unity was a precondition for kind of Pan-African unity and liberation. And I think even from the early 1950s, when he became leader of government business, still under the colonial regime, he began to think about convening a sixth Pan-African Congress, the first to be held on the African continent. This was originally scheduled to take place in 1952, but it didn't take place for various reasons. But Nkrumah organised the Kumasi Conference in 1953 that you'll be familiar with, which was a conference of West African politicians, activists, again to try and develop West African unity. At that time they had the idea of a West African Federation, even the United States of West Africa with a unitary government and so on. They said the establishment of a strong and truly federal state should give hope and create an atmosphere of goodwill amongst peoples of African descent all over the world. So again, there's this conception of West African unity as a precondition for wider African unity. And because of the nature of colonial rule, the attendance at this conference was limited. I won't go into all that. But amongst the speakers were people like, for example, Fumiransa Kuti came from Nigeria, and there were a number of different speakers. Then, of course, after independence in 1957, as you know, Nkrumah, with Padmore as his mentor and advisor on African affairs, immediately began to try to develop this wider Pan-African unity. As he famously said, we have done this battle, we again dedicate ourselves in the struggle to emancipate other countries in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent and so on. So Nkrumah began to develop this unity, first with the convening of the Conference of Independent African States in Accra in 1958, which was to try and build the unity amongst those few African states that were independent. As I said at the time, this is the first time in history that representatives of independent sovereign states in Africa are meeting together with the aim of forging closer links of friendship, brotherhood and cooperation and solidarity between them. And their aim from this moment was that these African states that were independent should give assistance to those states that were not yet independent. I'm hearing my voice coming back to me again. In the same year, as you know, Nkrumah and Padmore organised All African Peoples Conference again in Accra, which brought together both states and activists from across Africa and from the diaspora as well. And in that year, as a kind of practical demonstration of this African and Pan-African unity, a union was formed between Ghana and Secretariat Guinea. And the two countries agreed and pledged to coordinate defence, foreign and economic policies. So, as well as these conferences and statements and so on, Nkrumah gave a kind of practical base for this new Pan-African unity. And with the independence of Ghana, Ghana acted as a base for wider Pan-African struggles. It gave support to those who were struggling in other countries. particularly in southern Africa, but also elsewhere. So it was extremely important that independence of Ghana could act in that way. The All African People's Conference aimed to establish a permanent All African People's Organization and a secretariat in Accra, they said, to accelerate the liberation of Africa from imperialism and colonialism and to create the conditions for the emergence of the United States of Africa, or what was sometimes referred to as a Pan-African Commonwealth of free states. So this was their kind of conception of things in 1958. Then, of course, it became clear that in this struggle for independence, or in the anti-colonial struggle, the influence and impact of the old colonial system was still a kind of heavy weight. And there was a development of what came to be referred to as neo-colonialism, that is to say, states that were independent in name, but in fact, economically and other ways were still dominated by the old or new colonial powers. And so, building on the All African People's Conference in Accra, there were further conferences in which Nkrumah took a leading role, which re-emphasized this need for African unity. For example, the conference that was held in Tunis in 1960, which again called on the need for the mobilization of the masses as key to the struggle against neo-colonialism, and called for the organizing of all African organizations of trade unions, women, youth, farmers' organizations, and so on. As well as these calls and the contribution which Nkrumah made to develop this Pan-African unity, we can say a more practical example of it were the meetings of Nkrumah with Secretary and the government of Liberia in San Kelly in 1959, and the declaration which came out of those meetings, which called for what they called a community of independent African states. In other words, those states that were already independent should work more closely together to strengthen their independence and encourage the unity of vote. Nkrumah also tried in other ways to aid those states who were struggling for independence or struggling to maintain their independence. So, for example, in 1960, sending the troops of Ghana to the Congo during the so-called Congo crisis and the removal of Lumumba from power. And as you know, his participation in that crisis and the outcome of it strengthened his view that there was a need for a Pan-African army, a Pan-African high command, and so on. And he said that, and also the joint need for African governments, as he said, to avoid the evils of neo-colonialism, balkanization, disunity, and secession. Then in July 1961, Ghana, Guinea, and Mali established the Union of African States, which was open to all African states and which was presented at the time as the nucleus of the United States of Africa. The founders pledged themselves to pool their resources, to harmonize their domestic and foreign policies, and so on and so forth. And they called for other states to join in order to build this African unity and to achieve the complete liquidation of imperialism, colonialism, and neo-colonialism in Africa, and to develop the wealth of their countries in the interests of their peoples. Etc., etc., etc. Then, as you know, this period of the early 1960s was a period of both African liberation and anti-colonialism, but also the difficulties of building this unity, particularly because the impact of neo-colonialism the influence of the old colonial powers, the setting up of kind of rival groupings on the African continent and so on. But without going into that anymore, just to mention the Casablanca Conference in 1961, which was a conference held between, generally people like to say, the more progressive African states. Anyway, that's a judgment that you can have different views on. But at that conference, Nkrumah warned, he said, "I can see no security for African states unless African leaders like ourselves have realized beyond all doubt that salvation for Africa lies in unity. For in unity lies strength. And as I see it, African states must unite or sell themselves out to imperialist and colonialist exploiters for a mess of pottage or disintegrate individually." So again, this was his conception, the necessity of unity to prevent neocolonialism taking hold. So, then, as we know, Nkrumah played a very key role in trying to develop this unity and to develop an organisation of African states, which was eventually formed in Addis Ababa in 1963, when the Organisation of African Unity was formed. Again, that organisation was a kind of compromise. It wasn't an organisation which was concerned with a United States of Africa as such, but Nkrumah held it as a step in the right direction. And as you probably know, in the build-up to that Conference of African States in Addis, he wrote his famous book, Africa Must Unite, which was published in 1963, and was a culmination of work which he, Hadmore and others had undertaken throughout the late 1950s to try and build this unity. So in that book, he outlined the importance of things like we'd say a common economic trading area, like an African common market, and other forms of integration. He said that these were important to avoid competition, to pool resources, to aid development, to combat neocolonialism, and so on. And he particularly emphasised at this time that his Pan-Africanism was directed against neocolonialism and balkanisation, which he said were the biggest dangers facing Africa. He also drew on the experience of the major continental states in the world, the United States, the Soviet Union, Canada, and others, to show the benefits of unitary and continental-wide governments. Because they had economies of scale, they could pool resources, etc. He concluded his book with these words: "Here is a challenge which destiny has thrown out to the leaders of Africa. It's for us to grasp what is a golden opportunity to prove that the genesis of the African people can surmount the separatist tendencies in sovereign nationhood by coming together speedily for the sake of Africa's greater glory and infinite well-being into a union of African states." And of course, as you know, he said we must unite now or perish. So anyway, that was his conception. It was not taken up by most other African leaders at that time. But Nkrumah said, a major outcome of the Addis Ababa conference is that the existing blocs have come to an end. There is now only one Africa with a common aim and a common objective. That might have been a bit of an optimistic view. So, then we have, towards the end of Nkrumah's life, is, again, his continued resolution that the unity of Africa and African states was not in contradiction with the wider unity of African peoples and a kind of global Pan-Africanism. And this was particularly the case with his support and interest for developments in other parts of the world. He famously had discussions with Malcolm X, again in the mid-60s period, or early 60s, where they agreed that Pan-Africanism was also key to the problems of those of the African diaspora. As you probably know, Nkrumah also embraced the Black Power movement of that period and said Black Power is part of the world rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor, of the exploited against the exploiter, and is linked with the Pan-African struggle for unity on the African continent with all those who strive to establish a socialist society. And so in these years, he not only talked about political unification in Africa, but the unity of Africa and the diaspora. This conception of this is part of a wider world struggle of exploited against exploited. So, and he continued by sending greetings to the Black Power Conference, which took place in Bermuda in 1969, and offered to assist in organising a conference which more clearly united those struggling on the continent and those in the diaspora somewhere on the African continent. I also wanted to mention his commitment to, I suppose, what Nkrumah would have called the African genius or the African personality. That is to say, the importance of a struggle against Eurocentrism and for Africa-centred thinking, Africa-centred culture, Africa-centred history, which is illustrated by his invitation to W.B. Du Bois to come to Accra and to establish or to develop Encyclopedia Africana and so on, and many other examples of those in the diaspora being invited to come to Africa to work in the interests of Africans generally. So I think that was his conception of things. As I said at the beginning, his Pan-Africanism was something that was shaped by the circumstances of the time and the problems of the time that needed to be taken up. And of course, the problems of the 21st century are not quite the problems of the 1960s. Different problems exist to be taken up. I should also mention that his continuing adherence to the principles of socialism, and of course at the end of his life what he called scientific socialism. And anyway, again, I won't go into all of that now, but his seeing scientific socialism as being connected with dialectical and historical materialism, and the importance of analysing concrete conditions to find solutions for the problems that confront Africans worldwide. So that's a bit of a rapid romp through Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism, but hopefully it gives some basis for something useful.
Thank you very much, Professor Ade, for the run-through history in a very succinct way. It all sort of reminds us where we've come from, where we are, and where we are heading. And we've got to sort of be reflecting on some of the issues that we've just, or the points we've just heard about. Before we go into the questions that I hope there are a few to be asked, I just would like to sort of find out where you think we're sort of heading, given the history that you have sort of given us an overview of. In my own experience, very recently, I was contacted through the London Review of Books, which is an organization that reviews books and so on. And in one of their journals, somebody as a research student found a book in a small bookshop in Cairo. And he'd written an article in the journal. And it was about, the book was actually Africa Must Unite. And it'd been signed by Nkrumah, given to Muhammad Ali. And it'd been signed, Nkrumah signed it himself. And this gentleman found the book and he felt, no, this should be somewhere in Ghana. So he contacted me and he brought the book for me to have a look at. I did say, I told him, well, actually, I think this should be in Ghana. So I contacted the director of the Ghana Museums to find out how this could be sent to Ghana somewhere, even if it needs to be purchased. But unfortunately, there didn't seem to be any appetite for it, which I felt it was such a big loss, because these are some of the things that would remind us, especially considering what happened after the coup. Books were burnt, various important documents and artifacts were lost, and in doing that, we're losing a very important part of our, not only history, but our essence, spiritually as well, because we're not able then to connect with certain tangible things that we can feel, touch, see, to continue reminding us that we need to fight. So I'm not sure where the book is now. I did take a photo of it, at least, and make sure that I got a page with all the Nkrumah's own handwriting on it, in terms of giving the book as a present to Muhammad Ali then, and so on. So, to open up, my question is, how do you see the situation now and where we're going in terms of the future, in terms of African unity, working together as Africans, facing the challenges of today?
That's just a small question to answer. Let me say that, as I said during my presentation, that the situation is a little bit different today than it was in the 1950s or 1960s or 1970s. In that we have 60 years of experience, both particularly in the African continent, but also outside it. So one thing which is important is what is our summation of the lessons of that experience. What does that experience teach us? And one of the things it should teach us is we can't act in the old way. We have to act in a modern way. You could say that some of the questions which Nkrumah and others took up for solution in the 1940s and 1950s, they still remain to be resolved. The question of, if I go back to 1945, which I tend to do because it kind of sets out a vision of future Africa. So that vision hasn't yet been realized. Africa still has borders, it still has alien institutions, it still has, it's still dominated by the capital-centered system and so on. So unless these things are addressed, then there's not really going to be any progress. one of the things which Nkrumah said at the beginning of his life, not the beginning of his life, but the beginning of his, in the midst of the anti-colonial struggle, I think is worth thinking about. He said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom." Yes, so those of you who are biblical scholars will know how it ends. So one of the questions is, whose political kingdom is being sought? Because the experience of those 60 years is that when you seek to gain the political kingdoms of your enemies, you're never successful. That you have to build your own political kingdom. The kingdom's not really I'm not a biblical scholar, so we need another. But you have to develop your own political system. And one of the other features of the 1945 Congress was that it emphasized that it's the masses of the people that are the force which is going to move everything forward. So the question then poses itself, how do you organize amongst the masses of the people? And how do you create this new political system? And of course, you then have to consider what kind of political system is it? And by using the principles that Nkrumah discussed and adhered to at the end of his life, you see that that requires you to actually analyze what's going on in the world, what's going on in society. And so the kind of society that is needed is one in which the masses of the people are at the center, have empowered themselves and are the decision makers. Everything else is, anyway, is not a solution to the problem. So I think that task is still before us, how to organize amongst the masses of the people and how to build this new system. And the other thing which you could say Nkrumah's career shows, and many other people's career shows, is that you can't wait to build the new system at some stage in the future. You have to build it from today. So when we organize this meeting, we are in the course of building this new system. And of course, we also have to take account of what is the, as we could say, dialectical and historical materialism teaches us. We also have to look at what is the motion in society, what's already going on. Because unless we take account of that, then again, we're phrases like whistling in the wind. So these are all lessons which history presents us with of what actions we can take. The other point to make about the world today, which is also worth stressing, I would say, is that whether on the African continent or in Britain or whatever, we're in a different historical period. We're still in the period of in which people need to empower themselves, but we're in a period of, we can say, global retreat rather than global advance. That is to say, as we all know, in the 1950s, 1960s, the period after the Second World War, the struggles of the peoples of the world were in the ascendant for various reasons, partly because of the defeat of fascism and the weakening of the old imperialist powers and so on. And today we're not in that period. We're in a period of retreat. So that means you can't act in the same way as you may have done in the 1950s and 1960s, not just because you're older, you need to slow down or something like that, but because the world is different. You cannot act as you would when everything's in a state of advance. So in a way, the period is one of preparing, summing up, working out how things are going to be developed and so on. So without saying more, I think those are the kind of things that need to be looked into.
The other thing is because the world is different, the situation is different, then one cannot necessarily use the same definitions of things that were used in the 1950s or 1930s or the 19th century. We have to have modern conceptions, modern definitions of things, which doesn't mean that we don't look at necessarily the principles, but they have to relate to what's going on in the world today. So it's not just a question of, you know, quoting what Nkrumah said, or quoting what Marx said, or quoting what somebody said in different circumstances, but working out what's going on, how we apply these principles to the situation today. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is, I say, to look at the actual struggles that are going on, because of necessity, the situation in the world, which is very difficult for the majority of people, that struggle is ongoing. You know, the question is always for us, how do we intervene in that struggle to move things forward? How do we assist the people to realize their aims and aspirations and become decision makers, empower themselves? So I think that's extremely important. And as we know, the situation in Britain is not the same as Ghana. Ghana is not the same as Nigeria. Nigeria is not the same as South Africa, etc., etc. There are connections and interconnections. There are overriding problems of the big powers, of the big multinationals, of the new scramble, of the influence of new powers, China, the BRICS and others. But all of these things have to be looked at. So that's, anyway, maybe a long answer to a short question, but that's how we look at things.
Thank you very much for the answer. In fact, the idea of the retreat is a very interesting one. In other words, it's sort of reflecting on what's gone on since independence till now, and to, in a way, we sort of strategize in order to move forward. So it's a very interesting idea, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to discuss this further, look at how we can take things forward to build on what is past, taking into account the new developments, the new realities that we are living in. So on that, I'd like, yes, to open the floor for others who have questions. Sorry, I'm not able to send this forward, but can you?
Thank you very much. And thank you for your analysis of Pan-Africanism and Nkrumah's contribution. My name is Benjamin Kema. I'm a Nkrumahist. And I'll just respond to what, or react to what you said. Can I just say right from the beginning that what Nkrumah said, the principles that he stood for, are far more relevant today than they were in his time. The analysis that Nkrumah did was spot on. I mean, you look at what he said in those days, and you find that today it relates more to today, what's going on today, than it even related to that time. Conditions have changed, we are older, we've been through different situations, we are now independent countries, and so on and so forth. But you take even Ghana, the way our resources are in the hands of the multinationals, we effectively give away our resources to foreigners, right? And we are effectively slaves in our own country. And it's repeated right across the country, in the continent. And this is exactly what Nkrumah was saying, that if we remain in small independent states, we will not have the capacity to stand up to all these forces which are preventing our progress. So I would right from the beginning say that Nkrumah's analysis was far more relevant today than it was at that time, even though things, conditions have changed. Can I also just mention something that you said about Nkrumah's scientific socialism? Nkrumah was very pragmatic. That was another thing. He didn't just simply believe in scientific socialism. He, in a sense, worked with capitalists. Akoso Boda is an example. It was, a capitalist, and President Kennedy, who himself, the leader of a capitalist country, who were all instrumental in building the country. So, I'm just reacting to that. Yeah, okay. Okay, so there was a question, the question that I wanted to ask was, what sort of problems did Nkrumah face in trying to promote Pan-Africanism? And are those, do you have those problems here as well?
Yeah, thank you for your comments. So I'm reluctant to say all the things I've said already, so let me try and present it in a different way. To my view, the issue is not what is our outlook on approaching these problems? Is the answer to Africa's problems to continue along the same path? Is that what's going to solve things? Or is our conclusion that we need a different path, we need an alternative path? So if we look over the last 60 years or so, we have seen the conclusions of moving in one direction. The conclusion is that, exactly as he says, that the rich get richer, that the big multinationals dominate the continent, that the big banks dominate the continent, that the IMF dominates the continent, and the World Bank dominates the continent, and so on. That the masses of the people are not empowered, they're not decision makers, that those who run the countries are corrupt and siphon off the world of people and stuff. So I don't know what system, what you call that, and to me it doesn't really matter what you call it. But it doesn't work for the majority of people. So whatever it's called, it's not a good thing. It's not a thing which is in the interest of the people. So we need a different thing. So what is that different thing? So then we have to then it's not a question of being pragmatic, if you'll allow me to say so. It's a question of being scientific. What is it that's going to solve the problem? And we can, if we actually analyze the situation and the histories, we could say that, again, without going into it in big detail, that the solution is that those who create the wealth must also be able to empower themselves and to control that wealth. That means that the masses of the people must be, the decision makers must be empowered. Whatever you call that, you can call it what you like, but that is, in my view, I believe that science and history show that to be correct, that when the mass of the people are decision makers, are in power, that these problems can be solved. So that is, to me, the way I look at things. It doesn't matter to me, to be honest, whether Nkrumah said that or not. That is just the way that the problems present themselves today. And so I think that we have to find ways of developing that. If we look at the situation of Ghana between 1957 and 1966,
we can conclude that the mass of the people did not empower themselves. They were not the decision makers. And in fact, in very few African countries has that been possible yet. You can find examples of it, but not very many. And so that was one of the problems that Nkrumah and CPP couldn't solve. And I'm sure today you will go into discussing why they were unable to solve that problem. It has to do with a number of things. One is the conception of who should be empowered. So, you could say the modern conception of people's empowerment is not party empowerment. It's not a party being empowered. It's people empowering themselves. You can have parties which have a role, but this is an old-fashioned conception.
That's what we have seen.
People must be empowered. So these are things that one has to learn from history. How can this be developed and so on? And what is the conclusions of, looking at history and looking at the experience of Ghana or wherever? One can look at recent struggles. South Africa could be another example. A long struggle, all kinds of Pan-African support, including armed struggle and so on. So then, who comes to power? It's not the people who have struggled that come to power. It's a party that comes to power. What political system do they have? Is it a different political system from the old apartheid one? No, it isn't. Is it a new economic system? No, it isn't. So the majority of people in that country, even though they've fought for years, they're in a situation of poverty. One knows all what's going on there. So we've had time after time, we have this history over the last 60 years. Even when we've had armed struggle, and the people have empowered themselves through armed struggle, when in the period after armed struggle, something else happens. The whole system is kept in place. The people are disempowered, parties come to power. So when I say looking at history and making summation of it, that's what it means. And we learn how these things work. No. Why do they not work? So then we know what we probably do. Of course, we can see in those struggles the beginnings of the new. If you look at the struggles in various countries. In Guinea-Bissau, for example.
Hold it.
Established whole liberated area. They built a new society in the midst of the anti-colonial struggle, in which the people were the decision makers. That actually allowed them to wage the armed struggle. But then what happened? What happened? The same in Ethiopia more recently. The people took up arms against the biggest military regime in Africa, in northern Ethiopia. They built their liberated areas of people with decision makers. They built a new political system, a new economic system. But then when they overthrew the third, what happened? They put in the old political institutions and so on. And even though there's been all kinds of advances in Ethiopia today, we can see it's going in a different way. So these are the kinds of lessons from history that we have to take into account. The people are struggling for something new, for an alternative. And that is something which is arising from what's going on in society today. That's why I say we have to always look at the struggle that's going on. People are gravitating towards that. But it's how to realize and how to build it. And in a way that's not, as I've just indicated, it's connected with the struggles and successes of the past, but it's also taking account of the So, anyway, that's what I would say. I think also it's interesting to look, I don't necessarily want to make a big deal about this, but when we say pragmatism, what does that mean? Whose philosophy is pragmatism? What is the history of pragmatism? Pragmatism anyway, has its own history. It's even its own political history. would say generally, if one looks at it, pragmatism doesn't favour the interests of the people, generally speaking. I need to go. I know, just finally, I know a very important bookseller. I've put this book on the table, I didn't put it in. But if people are generally interested in this history, I've written a book about it, which is much wider than we're discussing today. It's available from all good booksellers who are here today.
Just a quick one before you go. Emmanuel, Prof. Nkrumah preached Africa must unite. Is it something attainable or to just parliament?
Well, I think it is possible, but there are lots of impediments to building it. Certainly, if one looks at you could say it would be something that would favour the African continent and the mass of people. So to have a united Africa, whatever that means, but to have all the economic resources of Africa at the disposal of its peoples and so on. But I think that the question is how that unity will be built and established. Again, if we look at history, we could probably say that it won't be built from the top. It won't develop through the OAU, it won't develop through the AU, it won't come from existing governments. It will come from the bottom in various ways, and it does require, the way that things develop. The struggles in different African countries are still develop at different rates. So if, let's say, Ghana becomes a country in which the people empower themselves and the decision makers and so on, then sure, that country can play a very important role in developing that concept within the continent and trying to strengthen it and so on. But it will still depend on the people of other African countries liberating themselves, being in a position to demand and put into practice that unity. So I think that these individual struggles that go on within these separate polities within Africa are important because governments exist, political institutions exist, economic systems exist, where the people have to struggle. It doesn't mean they can't struggle in unity with each other, but they have to struggle where they are, and they have to deal with particular problems where they are, and those struggles are, those struggles which are taking place in Ghana or in Nigeria or in South Africa are not just in the interest of the people of those countries, but in the interest of the continent as well. I should also say that the struggles which take place in Britain or France or the United States or China are also in the interest, because if we have a situation where the British government is not interfering and intervening in Africa, where the big multinationals which are situated in Britain are not interfering in African affairs, then that's to the advantage of Africa. So the question for us who may be domiciled in Britain, what we're doing to change the situation in Britain, so that also in Britain, people are empowered. So that the situation has changed here with the US and France and stuff. So, I think McGrath said this, people in the US said, they will come to Africa and engage in the struggle. He said, well, we're not saying that. Let's engage where you are. So those of us that are here, we hear something. We can't just be talking about what's going on in Africa and not doing anything here, because we're not in Africa. We may be doing all kinds of things to support what are we doing here. Nkrumah's history, or Padmo's history, or others, they also operated here. They organised here. They wanted to unite with the workers and less people here, and saw their struggles being linked with those sections of the population. So these are also very important questions. In short, there is one world, so there's one struggle, and these are all different component parts of it. But we have to operate to where we are. But yes, the answer to your questions, I think it's possible, but on the basis of struggle to transform things.
Thank you very much. I think there's time for one more question.
No.
My name is Olusi. I just wanted to pose a very quick question. What is your view of the new ECOWAS currency? What chances do you give it for success?
It's an easy question. It's a bit like saying what are the chances of the euro or something. Yeah, the chances were, what is the chance of success of the new ECOWAS currency? Yeah, I mean, these are I mean, if you look at it historically, you could say that it's an advance in the sense that currencies being developed which ostensibly has some kind of base in Africa, although even that is a bit debatable. I'm not an economist, so I haven't analysed it, but I suspect that underpinning it are all kinds of other things going on. But it doesn't, to my way of thinking, if one looks at it from the perspective of the masses of people and solving the problems that confront them, it doesn't. I always look at these things through the eyes of my family. It's not going to bring them water. It's not going to bring them electricity. It's not going to bring them all the things that people need. It's not going to transform or even lead to a transformation. These are things which are linked to the status quo of the existing systems. Anyway, there may be some marginal advantage for some people in West Africa, but the majority. Again, we can use the EU as a basis of looking at that experience. Does the fact that there's a single currency in Europe, whether Britain's in it or not, does that benefit the majority? Does it solve the problems of austerity? It doesn't address those things. So I get on with all. It's not something to get too excited about. Of course, these trading blocks and other things which have developed in Africa, various institutions of the AU and so on, African Parliament, one can say, okay, it's good to see that continental or regional solutions are being developed. But the question is, who is deciding these things? Who are the decision makers? The interests of it, A, do they advance the interests of the mass of people? And in my mind, they don't. I don't see any evidence of that. So I think that rather like those institutions of the EU, they favour the big monopolies in Europe, and the big powers in Europe, they don't favour.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
I'm getting local Wi-Fi.
Could we please give a round of
Can do it without losing money.
Okay, so we'll have Kofi Roberts